Hey everyone, this is Lomi, and this week it was finally painting time. I got started with primer on Rune's arms and legs using my favorite, Rust-Oleum Sandable Automotive Primer. The last time I did his fantasy blushing, I didn't use any primer on the arms, and they were the part that gave me the most trouble, so this time I'm going all out. I'm not recoating the pieces with resin this time, but I do want the paint to be sturdy. Since I really liked the result I got with Rillen's fantasy parts, I used the same green spray paint on the primered parts. This should give me a really durable base. Unfortunately, painting also brought out every last imperfection in his modified legs that I'd missed, but I don't feel up to sanding everything down again, so we're just gonna roll with it. I used my new Vallejo acrylics to airbrush the top of the leg to match his resin. I created a rough edge for the tape by tearing a strip in half because I don't want a clean edge, but I'll talk a bit more about that later on. This was my first time airbrushing with Vallejo colors, though I've been using the varnish as a sealant for face-ups for a while. I was really impressed by how easily they covered the dark spray paint, but I did have some issues with the paints because I found they dry really quickly. I'll probably get an additive to slow down the drying time because the speed at which they dried caused some clogging issues with my airbrush. I had some overspray on the legs past the tape, but it won't be hard to clean the acrylic off the spray paint. This time around, I'm mixing a lot of different types of paint, where last time I pretty much stuck to acrylics. The primer and green spray paint are both oil-based enamel, which is not at all harmful to doll resin when used correctly, which I spoke about when I painted Rillen's parts last year. Over the top I use acrylics, which allows me to use acrylic thinners to wipe off accidents or overspray without damaging the enamel paints. But I'm also using gouache paint over the enamel and the acrylic, and gouache can be cleaned off with just water. Even though I love the color of the spray paint, it's not a good match for the parts I didn't end up redoing, which includes the hands, elbow pieces, and the feet. So I use a mix of dark green and black Arteza gouache to airbrush on a gradient at the wrist and elbow, and also at the ankle on the legs. Gouache is as amazing with an airbrush as it is with a paintbrush, but it does have a lot of unique challenges. You have to thin with flow aid to ensure it won't bead up on the surface. And some colors, like this dark green, are granulating pigments that clump together naturally, so you'll never get a perfectly smooth finish. It'll always be grainy no matter what you do. On top of that, the consistency of airbrush ready gouache is so thin that it can actually leak out the end of the airbrush when you're not spraying, and that means you can end up having big splatters if you put the brush down for any amount of time. Fortunately, this upper arm doesn't need a gradient, just solid color, so I don't need to clean that off. Because it's water-based and super thin, it'll level out on its own and dry perfectly flat. I didn't apply any primer to the upper arms, just some sealant, but I taped them off the same way as the legs and used the gouache to apply a deep base color. This way it'll better match the elbow. This has to be handled very carefully until it's sealed, because gouache is really easy to scrape or scratch off. Then it's time for scales. Even though I prefer the way I did Rillen's scales using a vinyl stencil I made, I have to match Rune's redone parts to the pieces I didn't redo, so I used the old fishnet stocking method. This is the same pair of stockings I used when I did his parts before, so it's already pretty green in some places. I smoothed it all out, then used some sap green gouache to airbrush on the scales. This step is tricky because I have to apply a lot of paint, but not so much that it'll soak through the mesh. And it has to be as close to dry as possible before peeling the mesh off, or else it'll smear the paint. But I think the end result is pretty good. I'd played with the idea of having airbrushed scales on the top part of the leg, but ultimately I didn't really like how they turned out, so I wiped them off with water, and I'll do that a different way. Another disadvantage of the gouache is that because it has such an intensely matte texture, it attracts and holds dust like you wouldn't believe. So all the pieces need a little cleanup before I put gloss on them, but I think the patterning turned out okay. Since I didn't like the way the airbrushed scales looked on the flesh part of the leg, I decided to draw some along the upper edge by hand. Over the years, I have had a lot of people tell me that they really dislike the way I did Rune's scales, and honestly it kind of surprises me sometimes how much they seem to care. But apparently the reason for the clean break in his scales isn't really understood. And the reason I don't use a gradient for the separation is because it's supposed to be very stark, very sharp, like he was dipped into something that made him that way. Because he kind of was. It was magic that crept up him and changed everything it touched before the mages around him were able to stop it. In the books though, I also described him having a few stray scales above the change. So I added some of those with watercolor pencil. I may go over them with gouache to make them a little more opaque before I add the gloss, but I'm not sure just yet. As far as color matching, the patterning on his original painting was much bolder, but I think the colors are close enough now that once I can get some sturdy gloss to put on his newly painted parts, it'll look fine. I'll need to do some touch-up on some scrapes around his wrists at some point too. But the paint job is finished, and overall, aside from the dust that still needs cleanup, I think it turned out pretty well. The only part I didn't paint was inside the new knee joint, because it's already such a snug fit that even a layer of paint would have made it too tight for the knee hinge to fit. So the inside of the joint will stay stark white, but that's okay because paint there would just scrape off anyway. Now I just wait for the gloss to come in and this whole project will once again be complete. That's all for today though. Thanks for watching. Bye.